Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Rational Standard. As always, or well, unfortunately, it's not always the same lineup, but as sometimes is the case, I am joined by Dr. Morné Malan and David Ansara. Our rule is usually to appear quite informal and so on, and David didn't get the memo. He seems to be going to a very fancy dinner tonight. So, yeah, welcome everyone.
Which, my CEO duties demand it.
Yes, yeah, unfortunately. We go around calling ourselves these dissident rebels who go against the grain, but we also have our own little hiccups, and yeah, I'm one to talk.
Well, these
But
days,
yeah, I mean,
wearing a necktie is an act of rebellion.
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah, going back to tradition is actually the radical thing to do.
Reject modernity, embrace tradition.
Yeah, well,
Yeah. That's why
modernity is
below the
tradition.
camera I'm full loincloth at the moment.
Yeah, no, pre-modernism, not postmodernism.
Yeah, I mean, your life
Um,
expectancy might take a considerable decline if we reject all of the features of modernity, but putting that aside, there's some benefits to tradition.
Absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, today is a very special day. Well, I mean, it depends how you look at it. Today is South Africa's Tax Freedom Day. The Free Market Foundation has been announcing this day for South Africa since 1997. Um, so yeah, it's coming up on three, 4 decades now, actually, 3 decades. That we've announced this. It's a good day because it means that we've now taken all the days of the year where effectively we're working to pay the government, and now we get to keep some of our money. At least that's how it's kind of shown and manifested. Um, and today is that day, but it's bittersweet because we would like it to be earlier. If Tax Freedom Day is on the 1st of January of every year, then that means your tax burden is nothing and you spend every day of the year working for yourself. And of course, if Tax Freedom Day is the 31st of December, that means that everything you do and really everything you own ultimately belongs to the state. And yeah, we're on the 16th of May today. It's starting to get very close to the middle of the year, so it's somewhat disheartening that South Africans spend almost half the year working for SARS for the benefit of SARS, um, and not really keeping that money for themselves. And then many people wonder why economic outcomes and economic development isn't as good as it should be. So very simply, how Tax Freedom Day is calculated is one looks at state expenditure as a percentage of or as a component of the total gross domestic product. State expenditure doesn't just kind of cover revenue taxes that SARS collects, but also includes state debt, which is effectively future taxes, and yeah, debt financing and inflation as a stealth tax. So it takes that component, it divides it by the number of days in the year, and it adds one day, and that's how you arrive at Tax Freedom Day. Every country and every jurisdiction with taxes has a Tax Freedom Day. The Adam Smith Institute, I believe, calculates it for the UK, and I think there's many think tanks in the US that also do a similar thing. And the Free Market Foundation has been very proud to be associated with this work for such a long time. But yeah, of course, the work that we do, the substance that we do, is dedicated to seeing how we can make this day earlier and earlier in the year. So yeah, without further ado, that's my introduction to Tax Freedom Day. Let's get into the conversation. Morné, you're our resident economist here. What do you make of this? Uh, is it useful, do you think, to plot out kind of on a yearly calendar uh, to show taxpayers what the tax burden is? Because it's you almost get the feeling that sometimes even though everyone is a taxpayer, this idea of a tax burden is kind of amorphous, and it's not really a thing that you encounter that much. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's useful. I mean, just because it's so, it just makes it a little bit more tangible. For people in the audience and for us as well. Just think of everything you've had to do so far this year, all the work that you've done up until this point in this year, in the year. And boy, hasn't it been a year. So there's been a lot going on, and just try to grok it in your mind that just about everything you've done, if you calculate how much government spends as a percentage of GDP, and that's general government expenditure, you've not really worked for yourself at any point during this year. So everything you've done up until this point, in some sense, has just been for the government. And I think that really does bring it home. It's one way to bring it home to people that government is just absolutely swallowing up such an enormous portion of the economy. And I mean, just to give people a little bit of a sense of how this has changed over time, we were actually at mid-April in 94, 95, and we've moved on with more than a month, in fact. So it's not only the case that we have an extremely high tax burden, it's the case that the tax burden is ever growing and with no real signs of slowing down. So if it feels completely unfair that you've been working for government up until this point in the year, we got bad news. It's that the trend's moving towards a later and later date as opposed to an earlier date. And I mean, the other part of the ledger there is just the fact that we get very little for the taxes. There have been also some attempts to calculate a sort of net tax rate, which is attempts to give you the amount of value you actually receive for the taxes that you pay. And there, South Africa performs even worse. So not only do we get very poor service delivery, we also pay very high price for that poor service delivery. And Tax Freedom Day is just another way to really illustrate that to people and to really bring it home that we've got to at some point rein in the government, and it doesn't seem as though the GNU has militated much against that. But I suppose we'll see with the latest version of the budget, if indeed we do have a budget by next week.
Yeah, budget 3.0. Let's see if they have a third time lucky. But obviously, South Africans are really feeling the burden of having to carry this dysfunctional, corrupt, incapable state on their shoulders. And I think South Africans should do what Atlas did in that Ayn Rand novel that I haven't read, Atlas Shrugged, and just dare to shrug this burden off of their shoulders. I have read some other Ayn Rand novels before I get crucified in the comments. But yeah, so I think also Morné's point there is also really critical. It's not just that the tax burden is high. I mean, I think there are other countries, Scandinavian countries, other European countries that have pretty high tax burdens, but there's an implicit agreement between the government and the citizens who vote for them that they're going to get some kind of services in return. So in some ways, there's also this invisible double tax that also additionally hampers the ability of South Africans to provide for themselves. And if you consider all of the functions, the core basic elements of a state, we're just not getting that bang for our buck. So security, you have to pay double for that. You're paying for the South African Police Service, but you're also paying for your private security. Healthcare, you're subsidizing this very inefficient and ultimately dysfunctional public health system. And then you also have to pay every month to your private insurer. We do have world-class private healthcare, which is fantastic, and we should definitely do everything we can to preserve that and defend it. But it does add to the bottom line when you have to fund it yourself. Education as well. If you consider, I can't remember the exact proportion. I think education is the largest line item in the budget. And I think the next largest line item is debt servicing costs. But really, South Africans are not getting bang for their buck when it comes to education outcomes, anybody with a modicum of common sense will do anything they can to ensure their children get an education outside of the public healthcare system. I beg your pardon, the public education system. And that's why I've heard anecdotally that there are schools in Soweto that are struggling with capacity. They don't have enough students because people in those communities are sending their children elsewhere. They're sending them to some of these low-cost private schools or Model C schools in the suburbs. So, yeah, I think that's an additional burden. And so South Africans are working way too hard, and I think are very, very generous towards this government that really is not upholding its side of the bargain. So I wonder how long that patience will last, gentlemen. I'm not so sure it can be sustained forever.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of always been the more interesting thing to me, to be honest. Like as a libertarian, as classical liberal, my target is always going to be the state and kind of state oppression and overzealous interference in society. But I'm increasingly coming around to I can't blame the state. Like you have these bureaucrats, these statists, these politicians, and they are doing exactly what we've always predicted they would do. This is what kind of public choice theory says. This is what Austrian economics says. This is what liberal, well, at least kind of there was a time of idealistic liberal theory about what is the state and what it should be doing, but I think very quickly thereafter, liberal has kind of said, okay, well, actually the state operates a little bit differently in practice, and that kind of culminates in libertarianism in the United States. So to some degree, when Edward Kieswetter says, yeah, we have to kind of pay our taxes, what to do, it's like, okay, fine, he's sure that's what he's going to do. What has bothered me is that, for instance, the media certainly, but public intellectuals also kind of parrot this line. And David, you alluded to kind of the social contract in Scandinavia and in Europe, whereby, cool, you give us boatloads of money and we will give you good services. I've had the privilege of being in Europe a few times in the last few years, and yeah, I mean, uh, if any place tests my libertarianism, it would be Europe. Like if I turn the tap, it's a state tap, state water, it's clean, it's great, it works. Power is always on, kind of usually, not always, but usually it's a state kind of power utility. So yeah, I mean, in theory, I might be a liberal or a libertarian, but ultimately it works. So no big deal. So there is that social contract, and in that circumstances, there was born this idea that taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society, a functional, competent society. And sitting in Warsaw and in Zurich, you can be like, yeah, okay, I can see that. I can see kind of the implicit logic in that. But then you have journalists, university professors, and sure, some civilians who I think are just kind of not terribly politically conscious, saying that, hi, you see those tax evaders, you see those taxi guys, they're not paying taxes. What an injustice. You see, this is terrible because we need to pay for all these services. We need to pay for this kind of society that the state is trying to build. And you're like, yeah, I mean, just wake up. Just kind of get out of your ivory tower, go and see what is actually happening. Like, we do fork over a lot of money to the state. Forget about the tax evaders. Forget that they exist. The South African government is a terribly well-funded institution. I mean, let's not kind of beat around the bush there. It could do a lot if it had some measure of respect for its kind of mandate, if it had some respect for the people it's meant to serve, if it had some kind of competence. But all those things are absent, and therefore the money goes, and we get, if we're lucky, we get some spit in the face in return. And that's what we get. And then we're told, no, but we have to remember to pay our taxes on time, and we shouldn't complain about this. This is how society works. And it's just this thing about uncritically taking what we think is happening elsewhere and applying it to South Africa. And I mean, in taxes, that's a big thing, and that's what's increasingly annoying me. Other than okay, the bureaucrats in the state, they obviously want the money, so sure, I expect that. But why are the press? Why is the public intelligentsia contributing to that? Morné.
Yeah, that's sort of I was going to ask you, Martin. You mentioned the fact that there's almost sort of two levels at which this functions. There is sort of at the more abstract ideological level at which one has one's own convictions about what's better, as a universal rule or something like that. But I mean, and you mentioned the fact that in practice you could see the argument where it functions well. But do you think that there's sort of an analogous kind of realization on the other end of the spectrum? People who say, of course, we do believe that the state should take the lead, but on a practical basis, given the government that we have, we just don't think that this government should do it. Because obviously you could say that, and it is sort of a very different kind of compact that they have, particularly in Northern Europe with a lot of the Scandinavian countries. There it really is the case that the government are seen as, not political leaders, but almost kind of, technocrats who we elected you to get a job done. We don't really care what your beliefs are. We just want somebody who can run this particular service. And that's a very different system than we have in South Africa. And I think it's actually quite unique to their situation. But I was just wondering do you see that on the other end of the spectrum, either one of you? Because I do sort of, but I only see it when it comes to new expenditures or new tasks that the state wants to take up. I think at least part of the reason that we have so much resistance against the NHI is not because people all across South Africa don't believe in universal healthcare. It's that people don't believe that our government should be in charge of such a system. Which is I mean, it's good when it works in our favor, but for some reason it doesn't really work. It's not enough to break the status quo. So once something is entrenched, there's just no way of breaking free and saying, okay, regardless of whether or not you believe it's better for the state to do schooling than it is for private schooling, do you believe it's better for this government to do schooling as opposed to private schooling? And to sort of arrange your thoughts along those lines, because I think that if people do start thinking about it like that, it's not sort of, do you think that the state in the abstract should do it, but do you think that this particular government should do it? And I was just wondering whether you guys see that on the other end.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I bumped into an old friend of mine from my university days. We were out on a run, like a group club run, and he's been living in the Netherlands for many years. And he, asked what I was up to and what I was doing, and I told him about my work with the Free Market Foundation. And he said, "Oh, it seems in the South African context, like libertarian policy position just seems totally out of step with where a country like South Africa should be." And I said, "Well, no, it's the complete opposite. Like, if anything, this is exactly the place where libertarian ideas should flourish, because we have this broken social contract. The state is very bloated, but there's also a kind of an opportunity, I think, unlike other developed countries, to actually really ensure freedom for people." So I think a lot of these highly bureaucratized developed countries, if you think of Australia or Canada, many European countries, that bureaucracy actually holds coercive power. It's not just that these people are kind of technically minded people. And obviously there's some benefits to some kind of institutional knowledge and stability and so on, a strong civil service. But I think my observation is that ultimately the institutions are subject to the same patterns of human behavior. I think a lot of scholars like the recent Nobel Prize winners for economics, Acemoglu and Robinson, they'll talk about the importance of institutions, and they talk about inclusive institutions versus extractive institutions. And I think, there are definitely good institutions and bad ones. But ultimately, those institutions are populated by individuals with their own patterns of human behavior, which are fairly universal, a tendency to want to acquire more power and abuse it and so on. And yeah, I think there's other factors like kind of cultural factors as well. But my observation is that all of these state programs, like a National Health Service in Canada or the UK, I think those are good examples. No matter how well-intentioned, how honest the bureaucrats are, there is a kind of entropy that sets in ultimately, and it's kind of there's like layers of sediment on the bottom of a river. Like there's never a layer removed; it's always a new layer added on top, and eventually the sediment rises so high that you can't navigate that river. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of my observation. Obviously, there are more effective systems, less effective systems, but I generally think it's a good ideological prior to have to assume that states tend towards bloat and bureaucracy, and there's nefarious political forces that can exacerbate that. But I think generally it's good to be skeptical.
Yeah, and I think that because this is also a point that I like to make to people. When we say, or when one argues that we think that the private sector would be better at providing certain services than the state is, it's not only because we have a inefficient government, and it's not that we believe that the private sector is populated by all these competent angels, and the state is just filled with a bunch of incompetent demons or devils or whatever. And that is, Martin mentioned it, but that is sort of the central insight of public choice theory, is the fact that the state, just like every other individual, just like every other firm, is populated by people. People act rationally, and they have their own sets of incentives that they react to. And the reason why private institutions tend to, in the long run, do better than state-run institutions is because of the incentives that they face. It's the Milton Friedman line, really, although he wasn't part of the public choice crew, but still, it's the old line of, what is capitalism? Capitalism's a system of profit, but also a system of loss, and you need both of those things. You need people to be able to reap the benefits of success, but you also need people to face the consequences of failure. And the thing is, in the state, you just get neither one of those. In fact, it might be the reverse. When a state institution or state organ is run poorly, more often than not, the outcome thereof is that they receive even more funds. And that's, David, you mentioned basic education. That's been the trend there. It's the worse it performs, the more money it receives, and it can't fail. So not only do you have this highly centralized system, which almost forces everyone into one particular track. So in other words, a very concentrated failure system. So if you miss with the one arrow you have, you've missed everything, as opposed to a decentralized system where, sure, there are going to be some failures, but there'll also be some successes, and we can, and at least some people get something as opposed to nobody getting anything. And eventually the best people work out, rise to the top at the end. So it's this very concentrated system, and it's a system where the incentives are almost the reverse. Take Eskom, for example. The worse it performs, the bigger the loss it receives or accrues, the more it gets to raise the tariffs it asks, and the bigger the prospects of receiving a bailout from government. So what do you expect people to do in that scenario? The incentives are completely aligned to fail and fail ever more. So yeah, that's just the point, is that it's not that there's some sort of metaphysical difference between people in the private sector and people in the state. It's just that if you fail in the private sector, you're out of business, so you don't want to. And if you fail in the government sector, you get even more funds. So if it's not the case that you want to fail, it's the case that you're not really overly concerned about failing. And likewise, on the success side, there's huge benefits to succeeding in the private sector, whereas there's no real benefit to succeeding in the government sector. In fact, I think that quite often the government doesn't really know what success would look like when it comes to a lot of our state institutions.
Yeah, and when private sector succeeds, it gets punished by the state. And when the private sector fails, it gets subsidized or bailed out by the state. Just think back to 2008 with those too big to fail financial institutions. And the reason they got too big to fail is because they had all of these implicit guarantees from the government, the federal government in the United States, like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so they behaved recklessly. They lent to subprime borrowers, highly risky borrowers, and then the whole house of cards came tumbling down, and then they went begging to daddy government to bail them out. And then I think what irks me so much about that is then people rightly point out, like, why are the risks or the costs being socialized, but the gains are privatized? And they use this as a critique of free market capitalism, but it was anything but free markets in that example. So I think, go for it, Martin.
Yeah, I just think that kind of Morné's point there is insightful. One of my favorite essays that Hayek wrote is Individualism, True and False, kind of trying to explain after kind of the French Revolution and kind of the social justice decay that started around his time in the middle of the previous century, when rent seeking really became a discernible topic of public policy. And then many people from the conservative right started saying, yeah, but this is individualism. And Hayek kind of wrote this essay. I think it's the late 40s that he wrote this. And he said, yes, it is a form of individualism, but actually the true individualism, and then he keeps engaging with this word individualism, but what he was really doing was describing what liberalism is. And there's a line there that he wrote that's always stuck with me, and it is exactly what Morné said, is that liberalism is all about designing systems and institutions for society in which bad men can do the least harm. Hayek recognizes, and I think liberals and free marketeers recognize that, and there are exceptions. There are overly optimistic liberals who think that human beings are inherently good and that we must just kind of open the way and kind of let pragmatism and kind of trust be the guiding principle. But Hayek recognizes that in society you find the bad people, and bad people are always going to try and harm others, and they're always going to try and kind of accumulate power for themselves. And while that will tend to the state, that also manifests, of course, in the private sector. And what liberalism does, what the theory of limited government does, is to say, okay, we recognize that this is the reality. There's no point. And the socialists, of course, say that no, we must change what the human being is ultimately. But liberals say, listen, that's not how it works. This is normal. Bad people is a normal occurrence in society. We must channel energies, whether good or bad energies, into institutions and kind of activities that produce good outcomes and limit bad outcomes. And that's the genius of the kind of limited government pro-freedom paradigm. That is kind of our job to communicate, because people lose sight of that. Especially in South Africa, you see this constant refrain that corruption isn't only in the state sector, it's also in the private sector. Therefore, stop being mean to the government and the ANC. And it's like, no. It's a clear matter of incentives, and also the other side of this, and this is the uncomfortable conversation, is that this works in Europe because of cultural factors. That's all you have. It's either you have your institutional design, i.e., your kind of limited government constitutional design, saying, no, we're not going to allow these bad actors to get this kind of power over the economy. But if you don't have that, you have to rely on one thing, and you only have one thing to rely on, that is culture. And in Europe, they have kind of social pressures. The government, the bureaucrat, actually worries that his neighbors might think he's a bit of an asshat if he steals money, or that he does something wrong, and that actually means something to him, like in a very real sense. He doesn't want to be perceived as this corrupt actor, so he does a very good job ultimately. And I'm sorry, but we don't have that in South Africa, and we certainly have that nowhere else in Africa. I'm going to kind of go out on a limb and say that, and in many other places in the world. And that is why you have to ultimately kind of don't take the risk. Don't put your eggs in that basket and assume that we're going to be a Japan or a South Korea or a Norway. Go the safe route and kind of adopt the free market, low tax, high limits on government approach. That is ultimately the safer route.
Yeah, I just wanted to just do a little bit of bragging about our Tax Freedom Day coverage. So, for those readers of the Business Day, one of our senior associates, Richard Grant, who helps us with calculating the Tax Freedom Day every year, he's got an excellent piece in the Business Day, which I'd encourage you to check out. We also had some coverage in the Daily Investor, and we'll put links to these down in the comments and in the description. But yeah, today, 16th of May, is Tax Freedom Day. It happens to be my birthday, so my only wish for my birthday is that Tax Freedom Day becomes earlier in subsequent years. And yeah, I think also just that to note that this forms part of our Liberty First campaign. So, and policy proposals that we launched at the beginning of this year. And yeah, so in our size of government paper, which I'd encourage you to check out, we have some recommendations for how to ensure a more reasonable tax system. We're a pretty radical bunch sometimes, but I think that these are actually quite modest proposals. Reducing the public sector wage bill, eliminating or putting a strict number on the number of deputy ministers. So yeah, trimming the size of the government there. And then on tax reform, some income tax cuts and phasing out all non-standard taxes. So excise and sin taxes, capital gains, luxury taxes, those kind of things. So yeah, please do check that out. And of course, we should not forget about the very important principle of privatization. That lowers the burden on you, the taxpayer, and ultimately the state. And none of these services, like the provision of electricity or transport, could be need to be exclusively performed by the state. So, yeah, we've got a lot more detail in the formal report, but yeah, you know, we do some serious work around here. We're not just pod bros on a Friday. So, yeah, do go there and engage with our work.
Yeah, no, and there was kind of the one aspect of the Tax Freedom Day exercise is that it allows kind of a comparative exercise to kind of say when Tax Freedom Day falls in other countries, and not only in other countries but in other jurisdictions. But kind of part of that, and Morné and I have often discussed this in the office, is the idea of the mentality with which your government approaches you as a taxpayer, as a legal subject, and to kind of contrast that across the oceans and see what the difference is. And interestingly, something I think very radical has happened in the United States, and it's not what you think, dear watcher. It is, in fact, a executive order, another one, signed by President Donald Trump on the 9th of May, I believe. And it's called Fighting Overcriminalization in Federal Regulations. Now, Donald Trump is not a libertarian. Donald Trump is not a classical liberal, and Donald Trump does not favor limited government. So let me get that out of the way. But for someone who satisfies those three very unfortunate characteristics, this is, wow, one of the most radically pro-liberty, pro-limited government kind of instruments that I've seen from the United States federal government in a very, very long time. Now, just very briefly to just give you some insight, because this, Morné kind of pointed out, this isn't really receiving any coverage of note. So This executive order highlights kind of the complexity of the what is called in the US the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. In the US, unlike South Africa, they kind of consolidate all of their acts of Congress, but also all of their federal regulations in this one code. And it's about 175,000, so that's 175,000 pages of regulations over about 50,000 provisions, so sections. And the executive order kind of says that, yeah, there's a lot of these provisions and these regulations are criminal sanctions, and it's often strict liability. And strict liability means that you could commit a crime without intending to do wrong. So you just do something, you have no mens rea, you have no criminal intent, and you have now committed a crime. And that's at least problematic in jurisprudence. It's kind of accepted now, strict liability, but it's at least something where there's some tension on. And what this executive order does is it kind of it discourages, so it doesn't outright prohibit, but it does discourage federal regulators from resorting to criminal sanction as a punishment for violating a regulation, and instead says rather follow kind of administrative sanctions instead rather than criminal sanctions. And this is the important part. It kind of tells federal regulators to keep track of criminal provisions in their regulations. So this is for transparency's sake, so that people can in fact know when they are going to potentially commit a crime. So it kind of makes the 175,000 pages a little bit more accessible to the public, so that people don't go to prison or have to pay huge fines kind of unknowingly. And kind of long story short, this is to me, this shows that there is a level of concern, I would say, from the United States government about, my goodness, our legal subjects might end up in prison, and maybe we should tell them before they commit these acts. And you don't see this. You don't see this in South Africa, and the executive order is also kind of linked to development and growth. It's not strictly part of the Doge process, I don't think, but it is kind of aimed at improving efficiency and kind of it's part of a deregulatory agenda, which sees deregulation as part of economic growth, part of more economic development. And that's what the Free Market Foundation has been saying for years. We linked that in our kind of Section 12 project last year. Also a decriminalisation project, very close linkage between over-criminalisation of society and a reduction in economic activity. If you think potentially what you do could land you in jail, you're going to kind of be careful in a way that you don't want entrepreneurs to be careful in. You want them to be risk takers, adventurers, innovators, and so on. And the United States government, to some degree, sees this. And our government does not see this. And that is why potentially the Americans, well, they have a huge debt problem, but maybe ceteris paribus, their tax freedom, they could, in theory, start heading closer to the beginning of the year, whereas ours will just migrate endlessly towards the middle of the year and eventually towards the end of the year, because of this mentality, this idea that the state is the father figure and must set these guardrails incessantly in society. So yeah, Morné, I mean, you drew my attention to this executive order. What's your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think not beyond the fact that everything you said was completely right when it comes to deregulation and ensuring that there's less of a burden on ordinary citizens and ensuring that there's less harmful consequences for not obeying certain regulations. Beyond that, it's just the increased transparency, because that's also very important, is the fact that people should be aware and people should have a reliable means by which to acquire the actual expectations of every agency that they're governed by. And I think that's also one of the major accomplishments, or would be once this executive order is actually achieved. Because there's the old adage, I can't remember who coined the phrase, but it's possible to actually indict a ham sandwich if you actually want to, because there are so many rules on the books that it's very easy to actually find something that someone did wrong. And particularly when it comes to criminal liability, you want those to be not only as few as possible, but also to be as transparent as possible. And I think that again, just noting when it comes to our government, it really is the case that it's not just that they're not delivering, but it's almost as though they don't feel any obligation to feign that the fact that they feel as though they should be providing actual services. And you see it with or you see it increasingly and increasingly explicitly on the part of the government, where they're not even pretending to actually provide you value for your taxes at this point. And I think that at some point one has to say that either if you're not going to give, if you're not going to actually deliver the services for the money we give you, we're either not going to give as much money anymore, or we're not going to give it to you anymore, or you're actually going to have to deliver the services. And I don't see how that could be controversial from really anybody's perspective, regardless of how you feel about certain ideological matters. I mean, it should be fairly obvious that whether you want more tax or less tax, we should want some sort of equivalence between the taxes one pays and the services one gets. And part of that is also in the application of regulations, and in the application of or in the administration of all the various sectors in the economy. And we've just not seen any of that. And I think that it dovetails well with Tax Freedom Day, but more fundamentally, it just points to the fact that we in South Africa are also extremely over-regulated. And I think to a large extent, we don't even realize how over-regulated we are. It's the case that many of us are likely breaking dozens of rules on a weekly basis, which we didn't even know existed, but which can come down on you like a ton of bricks when the government does eventually decide to enforce that law. It's never the case that, or it's not the case that when government enforces these sorts of provisions that they're wrong. It's just the fact that they 90% of the time they don't enforce them, which sort of creates an expectation that they don't exist. And so I think on the transparency part, on the deregulation part, on just the actual communication with citizenry, I think it's really is an excellent law. And I think it's actually been scandalous that it's not gotten the amount of coverage that it definitely deserves. I know Trump's not an ideological guy, but every now and then his gut seems to fall into the right direction, but every now and then it falls in the completely wrong direction as well. So take what you can. When it's good, be happy. When it's bad, point that out as well. And hope that we'll get more of the former in South Africa going forward.
Yeah, I see one of the commentators in the chat was quoting Beria, who was the chief of police in the Soviet Union under Stalin. Show me the man and I'll show you the crime. And I think that's very apt. And, I think that goes back to the whole idea of the rule of law, that the law should be impartial, should be knowable, transparent, rational. It should have general application. And the problem with a lot of these rules and regulations that are created by the so-called deep state or the bureaucracy is that they're ultimately discretionary, and it's not too many degrees removed from Beria, who could summarily send somebody to Siberia to work in the gulags. It's the same principle. And I think, Morné, you were making this point of sometimes these laws lurk on the statute books or in some kind of obscure regulation unbeknownst to the public. But then if you misstep or you fall on the wrong side of the prevailing political establishment or whatever factions in control, then those laws can be used and weaponized against you. So even if it's supposedly harmless, some old law that hasn't been enforced in decades, you should still seek it out and root it out. So yeah, I think that's something to bear in mind. And just in the South African context, Martin mentioned the Section 12 campaign. So that was a campaign that we ran last year in the build up to the elections. And one of the things we noticed as the Free Market Foundation is that crime, this huge epidemic of violence that we have in South Africa, is almost goes unmentioned in the political discourse. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, if you travel overseas and you mention that you're from South Africa, one of the first things you'll be asked about is the violent crime. South Africa is known as, unfortunately, a kind of a murder capital and for car hijacking. And I'm often asked about whether my car has flamethrowers on the bottom. I don't know how that became a meme, but yeah. So and yet we have a government that's incapable of doing the basics of protecting life, liberty, and property through policing, enforcing the rights of citizens, and yet busies itself with all of these regulations that criminalize non-violent activity, like smoking in your living room whilst your domestic worker happens to be working in the kitchen, or what other examples did we cite there, Martin? Not allowing a labor inspector to visit your mine. These are all criminal sanctions, and I think not everything has to be criminal in order to be regulated or enforced. You can also have civil actions that involve fines or some other kind of censure. I think criminal activity really you want to be using in a very selective kind of way, criminal charges. So I'm now venturing out beyond my skill set, because I have two eminent legal minds on the pod with me. But I think we need to get back to a kind of a minimalist approach to criminal sanction. Must be used in a highly selective way.
Yeah, I mean the key thing here is, so just kind of more examples that come to mind immediately is obviously under the kind of, I think it's 2002 Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, you need a permit to do anything at all kind of that relates to mining, and that includes prospecting. So in theory, you could potentially, if you walk in a field somewhere, in your field that you own, and you notice something shiny kind of sticking out of the kind of the sediment or something, and you're like, oh, what is that? And you kind of take it out, piece of gold. Yeah, you've just committed a crime, and yeah, you could be fined for that. You could go to prison because you've now engaged in some mining activity, prospecting, without getting a permit from the state, going through layers and layers of bureaucracy. That's a crime in this country. If you film someone, if you film anyone without kind of not their permission. I mean, there's this idea of kind of a consent culture, and if you film someone, you need their permission. I think I'm a bit iffy on that, but I can see the logic. No, it doesn't matter if they've given their consent or not. If you're not registered as a filmmaker with the Films and Publications Board, you are committing a crime. That's a crime in South Africa. You could go to prison for that. And this is less to say, oh, what an absurd crime, because obviously no one enforces this. And David, you kind of mentioned this, and this was during the Section 12 campaign, the key comeback, the rebuttal. They're like, oh, guys, what are you complaining about? Yes, sure, it's on the books, but no one is enforcing it. Aren't you just kind of chasing kind of ghosts now? And that is a problem. The fact that they're not enforcing the bad law is a huge problem. It's a terrible law. We don't want it to be enforced, but that they're not enforcing it is a problem. Because you mentioned kind of Soviet communism. That is precisely what they're doing. They have created for themselves the political class, and in many cases they're not doing this consciously. But what they've ultimately done is they've created for themselves a situation where You don't even have to inquire deeply into whether your political opponents or the people you don't like, the disfavored groups in society, whether they've done anything big wrong. You just have to spend 10 minutes going through some regulations and you will find a crime that you can arrest them for and put them in prison. And many people will then think, oh no, but the courts will obviously kind of say, no, no, this you can't do this, it's unfair and so on. No, unfortunately not. Our whole episode last week was about kind of the issues in the judiciary, and we didn't mention this, but there is a very solid legal principle, not just in South African law, but kind of in English common law and so on, and European civil law, that you cannot go to court being charged with a crime in terms of a duly enacted law or regulation and say, oh no, but the state didn't enforce this against other people, so it's not allowed to enforce it against me. The court is going to say, yeah, we see what you're saying, but no, this is the law, and it's maybe regrettable that the state is not enforcing it consistently, but yeah, toughies for you. Sorry, not sorry. And you can go to prison. You can be fined. And yeah, it is absolutely a rule of law issue. I think Morné will slap me on the wrists if I'm mispronouncing his name. I think it was Tacitus, the Roman thinker. He said something like, the more numerous the laws, the greater the injustice or the greater the corruption, or something like that. And I mean, the guy said it in an era where the amount of laws, like statutes, you could literally count it on your hand, like the 12 tables, maybe one or two praetor kind of pronouncements. There was no body of statute in those days, and already he said this, like he was feeling, oh my goodness, the laws are growing more numerous, and he had to deal with something that you can read like in an afternoon. Today we have reams upon pages upon tons of pages, like the weight of the pages you measure in tons of rules and regulations that could land you in prison for years. That is normal today. It's not questioned by anyone of real note, kind of anyone with real influence on changing this paradigm. And yeah, it's we're over criminalized, and at least with Trump doing this, and again, I find it very odd that he's doing this. He is in many respects conservative in some of the worst ways possible. He's kind of as if you look at some of the immigration things that he's doing, I mean, yeah, border control and so on, that's potentially a good thing, but circumventing some due process things, that does indicate someone who doesn't put civil liberty too foremost in mind, as one might expect. And he's now adopted this thing. And I think whoever whispered in his ear, whether it's Elon Musk or one of the other South Africans who apparently surround the U.S. president, and said, "Listen, maybe there is something to be said for decriminalization." Yeah, kudos to them. This really is a welcome change of pace. I don't think South Africa is going to be copying this anytime soon, but if potentially some other countries could start looking at this and maybe start a trend, maybe in the West, of doing this, maybe it could filter down into South Africa eventually. I mean, that would be really wonderful.
Yeah, and I mean, just to get back to that point you made, Martin, I've never understood that argument. I've never understood, but it's becoming ever more common that people say, no, but I mean, we're not actually going to do it. It's sort of the argument on the Expropriation Act as well. Is sure there's a law, and yeah, it does say with nil compensation, but we're not going to do it. And I mean, if true, then why do you need the power to do it? Then we don't need the law. And if you're lying, then you've made my point. But I've never understood the argument that sure, just ignore that provision. That's never actually going to be applied. So don't worry about it. Well, that's a problem in and of itself. You can't have a bunch of laws on the books that you're not planning on enforcing. And if you're not planning on enforcing it, take it off the books. And I think that's at least partially what they're attempting to do with this executive order. Is they're saying, if we're not in a position where we're willing to say, where we're willing to push this to the nth degree, take it to its logical conclusion and ask yourself, is this something for which you think somebody should be arrested, should be thrown in jail, and if they resist, they run the risk of being killed? And that's really the way you should think about laws generally. Is, do you think that the thing you're trying to legislate warrants locking someone up, or if they refuse to get locked up, running the risk of actually killing them in the process? And I mean, it's just not sufficient to say that, sure, we need it on the books, but we're not planning to do it. Or we're only planning to do it in exceptional circumstances. No, that's just not how the rule of law works. It's all laws should be applied, and they should be applied without favor or prejudice. And that just, all laws and those that aren't applied shouldn't be on the books. And if we aren't willing to accept the actual consistent and equal application of laws, then we shouldn't have them on the books either. But I think that that really is something that has to change in almost our jurisprudential culture or something. It's all of these laws that quite often we have 6 or 7 laws which all govern the same thing. Just because, I was on expropriation now, on land reform. I think we do have about 4 or 5 different laws that all deal with land reform, and we just constantly have, we need a new law. And the new law is going to say something slightly different from the other laws, and we just can't keep adding to the law books, because at some point nobody knows what the rules are. And that's the worst of all possible worlds, is that you get to a point where nobody's entirely sure whether what they're doing is running afoul of the law or not. And that just, the amount of uncertainty that creates is at least partially why we don't have investment. You've got this labyrinthine maze that you have to work through in terms of the regulatory process. And whilst working through that, you have to actually work through, but which of these are actually going to be applied and which aren't? And I think more often than not, you're in a situation where, and I think you see this as South Africans on quite a consistent basis, where it's much, much more difficult to actually follow the process as it's laid out than it is to just, find some way to work that doesn't necessarily conform to everything, but nobody expects you to conform to all the rules. Just think about all of the various building regulations, all of the various regulations that homeowners are supposed to follow. Most of the time, when you're trying to actually follow all of the provisions, you've upset the municipality. You've upset the actual guys who are supposed to follow the rules, because they just don't expect it. You've actually created a lot of work for them, which they feel is just entirely unnecessary. And if that's the case, just take the rules off the books. But yeah, and that's on a personal level. But on businesses, it's even harder. And I see we are now at a level where, or at the point where, you've got government spokespeople saying out loud that if investors don't want to invest here, then let them invest somewhere else. They must go somewhere else. And that's talk about as though investors actually needed to get that advice from the government, as though they haven't been doing that in any case. So yeah, it's sort of it's a important story, not only from the civil liberties perspective, but also from the broader economic perspective. Is nobody wants to take part in a game if they don't know what all the rules are, and they don't know which of the rules are actually going to be applied and when. And it's just I don't know. you see it's garbage in and it's garbage out. We do a bunch of bad things, we're going to get a bunch of bad results. And I mean, that's at least one of the points which is inarguable and which everybody agrees on, is that we're getting very bad results. For some reason, some people think that we're putting all of the wonderful things into the pipeline and we're just getting really poor results. To me, the more obvious conclusion is maybe it's the bad regulations that we're sort of funneling in that are bringing that are causing the bad outcomes, as opposed to just something going wrong at some point in the pipeline.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a key thing that people in South. I mean, I think I've always only seen this in South Africa. I wouldn't say I'm a close follower of politics elsewhere, but this idea that the policy is good, it's only the implementation and the outcomes that are bad. I haven't seen that in American discourse, in European discourse, or elsewhere. I've only really seen it here, where there's this preoccupation with no, our policies are actually all quite good. No, it's absolute hogwash. Our policies are atrociously bad. And I think that kind of leads us into the last topic for today. Our policies are so bad that they have created what some are calling and others are dismissively uh, 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 engaging with as something of a humanitarian crisis that has now spawned refugees that have this week arrived in the United States. So, as I think everyone watching now will probably be aware, um, Donald Trump earlier this year in January took note of the Expropriation Act specifically after Ramampara signed it into law. That kind of created a big firestorm of engagement between the US and South Africa, with the kind of litigation against Israel looming very large in the background, but the kind of twig that broke the camel's back was the Expropriation Act. And that really, I think, led to the Americans taking a bit of a closer look, let's say, at the South African policy paradigm that they haven't done in a while, maybe. And there they discovered, yeah, I guess let's not beat around the bush. That they discovered that there's a lot of policy that is premised on racial treatment of people. Obviously, Black South Africans are in practice the biggest victims of bad policy in this country. I don't think one can kind of dispute that in any meaningful sense. Poor people are generally going to feel the brunt of bad policy, even if it's not aimed at that. They're going to feel it the hardest. Things get more expensive, cost of living goes up, the investment, as Morné says, dries up. So even if it's to their benefit in on paper, it's really going to disadvantage them the most. But white South Africans, and to a not insignificant degree, but to a lesser degree, Indian descended and mixed race South Africans, are in a very real sense targeted. They are singled out in many pieces of legislation. They are certainly singled out in political rhetoric, whereby the way that legislation that might have race neutral language is going to be implemented, they are certainly singled out in that space. And the kind of least noticed area where this is happening is in the judicial record. Our courts have been, I think, as someone who is doing a doctorate in law, I have to cite these cases. It's the bane of my existence. But our courts have been very unambiguous about what is happening in South Africa. They say the quiet part out loud. They say that minority people from minority racial groups in this country, specifically white South Africans, will just have to take it on the chin. Kind of, if we knock you down, stand up and kind of carry on, is what the courts say, because you will have to be sacrificed in this grand project of racial engineering that the government has bravely kind of taken on since 1994. And that's fine. People have noted that for decades in this country, saying this is happening. Of course, it is happening. It is right that it is happening. We have to do it. We, I think, from the Free Market Foundation, from the Institute of Race Relations, we think there's a better way, and we've disagreed with this policy approach. But we've been having the same conversation, I would say, to a large degree. Enter Donald Trump this year. He says bad things are happening in South Africa. They have racialized policy. And suddenly, guys, and I mean magic, this is real kind of magic playing out in real time. Suddenly, none of this ever happened. Suddenly, we've been kind of imagining that there's been differentiated race-based treatment of people in South Africa, and no, it's disinformation, and it's none of this has happened. The government has treated everyone equally in line of the constitution, and it's Fikile, or no, I think his name is Staden, someone who works in the ANC, put out a press release this week saying that the ANC and the South African government are fiercely committed to non-racialism. No one is being victimized on the basis of their race. And this is all just kind of a propaganda campaign by treasonous South Africans whispering lies into the ears of the Americans, whatever. But ultimately, there has now been a regime adopted that allows not just Afrikaners, but anyone of a racial minority. I think the guidelines are quite clear in this respect. You have to be a farmer, or you have to be a member of a racial minority who has or fears some kind of race-based ill treatment, and then you could potentially qualify for refugee status in the United States. And this week, the first airplane landed in the U.S. with 49 or 59. The number keeps changing. Mostly Afrikaners. I think all of them are Afrikaners at this stage, becoming refugees in the United States. This has obviously led to the expected explosion in condemnations, because if you're white, you can never be a refugee, apparently. And there's no mistreatment of people on the basis of race in South Africa, it is said. So yeah, this is the big topic this week. We've left it till last. I think let's dive into it. David, let me start with you. What's your take as a Soti, an English South African who apparently doesn't qualify? Let us hear it.
Yeah, I'm starting to regret not paying attention to Afrikaans class at Bryanston Primary School. I think I thought I would never need to speak Afrikaans, but I was wrong. But yeah, so I think jokes aside, I think you described it very accurately, Martin. I mean, I think there's this myth that we're living in this non-racial rainbow nation, and that we, section 1, non-racialism of the Constitution is prevailing, and it's this inclusive society. But that is not the case. As your research has illuminated, there are 142 race laws on the statute books. And Afrikaans speakers in particular, I think, are treated like second-class citizens, and there is no equality at law. Yesterday, we were at the launch of Dr. Ansara's Lex Libertas, which is his new movement designed to spur South Africans towards decentralization and community empowerment. And we were there to show our support for his work. We're also big proponents of decentralization. And he made the accurate point that we need to be honest about the failures of the post 1994 system, that we actually have a systemic problem. We don't have a governance problem. And there is this narrative of original sin of white settlement in South Africa being fundamentally wrong, and that all policy interventions are designed to atone for this original sin. And so you have ordinary, hardworking South Africans who want to make a positive contribution to the country who are vilified. And when they then take up an opportunity to go abroad, which is their right to do so, then they're seen as traitors. So I'm not quite sure what people want. Do they want to drive the whites out, or do they want them to submit themselves under the current regime? I'm not sure. So, yeah, Soti lives matter, I see. Yeah, no, I'm glad that somebody is taking up our cause. Yeah, so I don't want to mention what the etymology, the background to the term Soti. We might get this content banned by YouTube if we delve into it too deeply. But yeah, I think at this launch, Professor Koos Malan was there, and just on this point of the Constitution, and it's held up as this glorious document that really reflects the building of a new nation. But as Professor Koos Malan indicated in his opening speech at the address, the Constitutional Court is bearing silent witness to its own irrelevance. And I was running through Bromfontein this morning with my running club, and we ran through the grounds of the Constitutional Court, and those words were still ringing in my ears from last night. I was pleased to see that the flame of freedom that burns in front of the court was still alight. So maybe that's a flicker of hope for us South Africans. But I think the fact that the Constitutional Court refused to even hear the Kill the Boer case just really shows that we're living in a system of one set of rights for one group of people, and another set of rights for another group of people. And I think that really flies in the face of equality at law. I'm going to ignore the comments because it's breaking my train of thought. But I'll hand over to Dr. Malan.
I got to be honest. It's and Martin and I spoke about it before we started recording as well. It's been thoroughly depressing seeing everyone's reaction to this week, to the news of this week. And it's just that, I don't know, it seems like everybody, and I'm not sure, this is where you sort of get into the point at which you ask yourself whether it's really been on net a good or a bad thing for the Americans, and then I suppose in particular for Donald Trump to have gotten involved, because everybody's just sort of gotten their walls up, and now it's a team sport kind of thing where nobody's willing to give an inch, and nobody's actually trying to get to any firm or even considered conclusions. I mean, when it comes to just the notion, and the fact that on almost every news outlet you saw the scare quotes between on refugees. 49 refugees arrive in the US. I mean, just the consideration of what actually qualifies as a refugee, and I sort of agree with Martin that there is this kind of implicit notion that white people can't be refugees. You have to be brown to be a refugee.
There's a sort of a soft bigotry to that as well. That seeing black people as inherently refugees.
Well, it's we know which are the poor countries, right? It's the ones that are ruled. Yeah. Well, in any case, but yeah. So that's
all of the Greeks who fled Turkish persecution and came to South Africa all of those decades ago.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the one thing, is just what actually qualifies. And I mean, in most cases, and I'm not even 100% sure that I'm convinced that the refugee status is really is really appropriate in this case. But given that it's been applied fairly liberally in the past, I can't see why it would exclude Afrikaners, or, as Martin rightly mentioned, it is important to say that this actually applies to all minorities in South Africa. But and another thing that I just think people seem to we've sort of gotten used to the way things are done in South Africa, and we don't really realize how peculiar our particular legal system is. We've gotten very comfortable with a lot of the things that should be extremely uncomfortable. I mean, there are if you really put some of the actions by government into perspective, and you offered that to some other people in different countries, they'd say those are grounds for revolution. I mean, just in COVID, when they actually wanted to provide aid to businesses, they said, okay, but we're going to do it on the basis of race. So we're going to destroy businesses, with lockdown, and then we're going to selectively apply race, filter all of the funding that we want to provide through the prism of race, and I mean just the sectoral targets now as well. I mean, yeah, and just the notion that, and this I've also said, I'm not sure if I said it on the pod, but the notion that just because a particular group of people are successful, that means that they're automatically excluded from being categorized as refugees. My sort of measurement is what's the one form of discrimination, or the one big example that everyone knows of, an ethnically targeted group. If it doesn't qualify under those rules, then you've got a bad definition of of what would qualify as refugee status. Because in the Second World War, well, prior to the Second World War, and in the Second World War, in Nazi Germany, the Jews were economically successful, and they you could very easily have had the exact same media that we have today that say, oh, but look at that, how can they be refugees?
Yeah,
They're
look, they
so
own a
rich.
jewelry shop. Why
Yeah.
why are they complaining about Kristallnacht? It's just a broken
Yeah.
window.
Yeah, good old, the money banks there from, that owns the financial system. He thinks he's a refugee. Whilst we all know that they control a disproportionate amount of the wealth in the nation. I mean, that is literally the argument here is, they control a disproportionate amount of the funds, and therefore there's almost nothing you could do that would be unjustified. And I've seen they've sort of gone back from that initial argument, but there was a point at which the sort of defense from the government was really, no, we're not doing it, but we really should be. In a just world, that is exactly what we'd be doing, but we're not. So don't judge us. And that's what you're saying when you say no. There's minorities have disproportionate amounts of wealth relative to their percentage of the population. You're actually saying that we really should be actively discriminating, even though according to them they aren't. So yeah, I mean it's been depressing on all sides. On the other side, it's also been kind of depressing that, and I don't it gets back to the definition of refugee, where people seem almost to be backed into a corner where they feel, okay, unless we can say there's genocide, we can't really justify refugee status. So rather than debating the premise, they say therefore we must say there is genocide, which I don't think is necessarily as simple of an argument as many people have made it out to be. So yeah, all in all, it's been a very, very sad week for South Africa, and hopefully in the long term, I think that has turned up the heat. I see there's someone in the comments asking about the Cyril Donald meeting this week. I think that was almost certainly part of the consideration for why the refugees were brought in this week, is because next week there is a meeting, and I suppose it's sort of what is it? It's a cliche to say it, but I think that's probably part of the art of the deal approach to these kind of things.
Yeah, and the kind of thing that's really gotten me down, and I told someone last night that some people are very excited about the things that have been happening this year, but I'm leaning more towards the utterly depressed part. So I think the refugee status thing is a good thing. I think this is a good thing. I think the mechanism, as you alluded to, Morné, is potentially not the correct one. I favor open borders. That's what people love me for many reasons. They hate me for one. I favor open borders. So that's the kind of the one thing that I don't sit quite comfortably on the side of many of our followers on. So I think that if you're a Black South African, you want to flee the unemployment that is being imposed on you. You're not You're not just kind of unemployed. You're forced into unemployment. If you want to flee that to Europe, to the US, I think absolutely you should be able to do that, absolutely, with no questions asked. But that is not the reality that we live in. We live in a reality of borders and mechanisms through which one must flee to escape persecution. Would I have preferred that Trump gave a blanket refugee status to all South Africans? Of course I would. Of course I would have preferred that. That would have been significantly more equitable, far better. That does not mean the fact that he didn't do that, that Afrikaners are not and racial minorities are not racially discriminated against as a matter of state policy in this country. That does not make that untrue. And what has been so depressing to me, again, is liberals, classical liberals, and libertarians have been saying that this is wrong. Afrikaners cannot be refugees. They thrive. They are doing well. It is such a aping. It is such a mimicking of the polite company woke discourse that infects our own side of the divide, and that has been extremely discouraging to me because when I became a libertarian 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and kind of developed in this arena, I was under the misapprehension that we exercise our critical faculties at a far higher level than other people from other ideologies. And I mean, that's just being completely blown out of the water since the beginning of this year, when liberals and libertarians and free marketeers took the side of the South African state against Donald Trump because it's Trump and he said something bad about EWC and now we must support EWC. Yesterday, Dean McPherson, the anti-EWC DA Minister of Public Works, was defending the EWC Act. Why? Well, we don't know, but I think the fact that the heat has been turned up from the Americans, that he now just kind of by default has to suspend his critical faculties and take the side of the oppressive, the repressive South African state. That does not mean there's genocide in South Africa. There is no genocide in South Africa. There's a hell of a lot of genocidal rhetoric in this country directed at racial minorities, specifically Afrikaners and Indians. And that has been normalized. It's kind of normal to hear genocidal rhetoric every day on Twitter, on TV. Like it's just kind of okay. There is no genocide actually happening. White South Africans thrive. We are not suffering as a general rule. Of course, it's getting worse for everyone in this country, but that is not the criterion for refugee status. The criterion for refugee status, according to international law, which is actually irrelevant in this case because the Americans have designed their own criteria, and that's what they've chosen. So they get to do that. That's a right that they have as a country. But according to their own criteria and international law, you have to be targeted, persecuted based on your race. That is simply undeniable. That is, you cannot deny that that is happening in South Africa. Now, the fact that the state is piss poor at actually doing that does not mean it is not happening. Every time the state has adopted anti-white, anti-Indian, anti-colored legislation, those communities have adapted to their new reality and they have lessened the impact of that repressive legislation on them. And Black South Africans did this during the previous era. So most apartheid legislation was not directed at Black tribesmen in Zululand and in Transkei. It was aimed at socially mobile, increasingly successful urbanized Black South Africans who came into the cities, got jobs, built houses, and started competing with poor white workers. These were the kind of economically mobile Black South Africans becoming entrepreneurs, becoming successful in the cities. And lo and behold, what happened? The state started targeting them because of their success with racial legislation, and they would have qualified as refugees. They were being targeted on the basis of their race for their success. So yeah, it's extremely disheartening that this paradigm that I've just set out is just being denied by people from our side of the divide for no reason that I can really discern other than the desire to be seen as part of the polite company that goes against Donald Trump. Now, people get a conclusion from this and they say that, well, maybe then Trump should have stayed out. No, I think on net, it's good that the heat is being turned up. I think it's good that some dynamism is now being introduced into our discourse. So I wouldn't give that up. But we cannot deny that people on our side have a severe bout of what is called Trump derangement syndrome, which of course goes both ways. Some people are so deranged in love of Donald Trump that they can accept no criticism, and others, unfortunately, which applies in our circumstances, is there is a kind of tangible hate for this guy, that anything that he does, even when it is good, even when it is appropriate, even when it is actually morally perfect almost, they cannot accept that, and then they will just jump to the other side of the political divide on a dime. So yeah, I mean, this is extremely kind of disheartening to me.
Yeah, I think Trump is not the most subtle of figures, right? He tends to shoot from the hip, and he kind of thinks in these binaries. But actually, in our response to Trump, you have to be kind of nuanced about it. You know, Martin and I attended a dinner talk a few weeks ago, and the speaker there, his talk was called "Good Trump, Bad Trump," and you know, on the one hand, you've got deregulatory measures, decriminalisation of non-violent conduct, like what we were talking about today. That's good Trump. And then on the other hand, you've got bad Trump, which is slapping tariffs and using that as a as a bargaining chip and potentially disrupting the entire global trade system. And you know, I think on this particular issue around racial laws in South Africa, around confiscation of property, around South Africa's conduct on the international stage, Trump is basically right. He's directionally right. It's unfortunate that he fell into the genocide trap and just kind of like shot from the hip and said, yeah, there's a genocide going on in South Africa, which actually harms the cause, I think, that we're trying to advance here. So hopefully his advisors tell him to steer clear of that term. But like Martin says, you know, there's a lot of highly inflammatory racial invective, which, you know, are signals of genocidal intent. So, you know, I think we should actually take that seriously. We shouldn't be too glib about that. But yeah, just on the refugee question itself, I do think that people have a right to exercise that option. I think if you think of the work of Albert Hirschman, is another book I haven't read called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And you know, you have, when faced with a corrupt, dysfunctional system, whether it's a company that you're procuring goods or services from, or a country where you live, you have this option of either raising your voice, challenging the status quo, or exiting. You know, exit must be a legitimate option in your arsenal. And so those people are exercising that option. But I do think ultimately that harms the prospects for turning South Africa around. And we need capable, skilled people with resources and a willingness to push back. And that's why we do the work that we do. But at the same time, I don't begrudge people who are running out of options from taking up that offer. And I was very fortunate enough to attend a meet and greet that Colonel Chris Wyatt hosted, I think it was the week before last here in Joburg. And I'm sure viewers of the Rational Standard will be familiar with the retired Colonel Chris Wyatt and his content on YouTube. And yeah, just a big shout out to him for raising awareness on both sides of the Atlantic for what's going on here in South Africa. I think his interest, his knowledge of South Africa has been really deep and important. But, you know, there were a number of people there, mostly Afrikaans speakers. And all of the questions from the audience was about, you know, how do I take part in the refugee program? You know, will I be able to get a job? Can I bring my cat with me? And, you know, it was actually kind of a somber affair, to be honest. And so there was a lot of people there who want to make a difference. They want to see a better South Africa, but they also, you know, they're on the edge of throwing in the towel. And I think that's quite sad. So, I think we get caught up in some of these debates, and they're quite emotive. And you see a lot of people on Twitter saying, when they don't agree with you, go to America. But it's actually a serious thing, and it's sad that it's come to this. And so I think this should be a moment for us to pause and reflect and lower the temperature and say, actually, what is the direction that we've been going on as a country? And how do we have a frank conversation with our fellow citizens about how to fix some of the problems that we find ourselves in? So I think that's a closing comment from me.
Morné, yeah, our time is basically coming to a close. So I'll also give you a few minutes to just give a closing remark.
Yeah, no, I think we're sort of ending on a downer here. So I think something to look forward to is actually you do see sort of a shift in powers, and you do see a lot of attention being brought on things which have gone almost criminally unnoticed by the rest of the world. So I mean, in that sense, it's quite positive. And now let's keep our eyes on the outcomes of the meeting between our president and what is a hashtag not my president of Cyril Ramaphosa and Donald Trump, who, by the way, is also hashtag not my president, because I am at this point not an American citizen. But but hey, guys, let's keep our eyes open for that. I think at the moment we follow almost always the worst possible road in policy. So any change, of course, it would be an improvement. If you're always doing the worst possible thing, then changing anything at all would be for the better. So let's keep our eyes tilted on what happens this week, and just be sure to log in on the Friday of next week, where we'll be talking about it. So yeah, thanks everyone, and see you next week.
Yeah, thanks, Morné. No, I think what you allude to there is important. We and I always try to do this as well, that we need to stay not positive, but we must avoid being defeatist kind of without kind of that's just an imperative. If you're a defeatist, then there's no point to kind of any of this. And as I said, I think what has been happening around South Africa, not in South Africa, around South Africa since the beginning of this year has been, in my view, a very welcome change of pace. You alluded to this as well earlier. I think that we've grown accustomed to things that elsewhere in the world actually would inspire revolution, and we just kind of normalized it, and we were very comfortable in that state. I think, and I include myself. It's kind of, oh, okay, everything is bad, so we point it out and we say how it can be not bad, and we kind of move on to the next thing, and that was kind of a routine. But this year has been markedly different, and primarily I must thank the Americans for that, and a few former South African Americans as well for making this an issue. There are some forces in Europe, unfortunately not quite in power, that are also taking note of what's happening in South Africa, and that is all good. So the eyes of the world slowly, but surely, I would say, are starting to focus again on South Africa. We have to solve our own problems, but a little bit of help from abroad is always welcome. Help is always welcome. And the but ultimately, what we're facing is not existential, provided we do something about it. And that's something I always find a lot of solace in, is that if you're in any society and you're being oppressed or you're being repressed or things aren't great, that is being driven by always a minority of people in the kind of ruling clique. The ruling clique is always a minority of people. Survey after survey shows that most South Africans, regardless of race, are kind of, they want to go along to get along. They don't hate people. They don't or harbor ill will towards anyone in particular. They just want to thrive. So it's not like Afrikaners or racial minorities or the productive, regardless of race, are surrounded by a sea of people who are baiting for their blood, baying for their blood. It is really just a tiny minority, but a vocal and an active minority, and that is where their power lies. They are fiercely dedicated to their evil, and that is not going to stop. They are not going to stop. The journalists who kind of accuse people of treason and disinformation, and these people are not going to stop. They are very committed to what they're doing. But us stopping them is as easy as organizing an equally sized or larger, hopefully, minority of voices and dedicated people just taking that step, doing things. And not everyone is kind of has time for this, but that does mean you're gonna have to kind of in addition to your double taxation, you're going to have to provide some support, some financial support to institutions like the Free Market Foundation, like Rational Standard, like Sakeliga, like Lex Libertas, like the Solidarity Movement. Provide them with the tools to fight this battle on your behalf, because then really the sky's the limit for reform. Things become far more possible, and always remember that 100,000, 200, 400,000 people can leave the country. I promise you, they would much rather come back and live here again. So don't write them off. If things go better in South Africa, it's actually more likely that they would in fact return, because this is such a great place to be. People always tell me the weather is great. I disagree, but let me just throw that out there. The weather is apparently great. The people are very friendly. Even when the economy is doing well, things tend to be far more affordable than they are elsewhere around the world. So it's a place that people want to be in, and actually turning the ship around is not impossible. It is not a mountain that we have to surmount. It is actually something that takes a little bit of organization, a little bit of dedication, and really ultimately just activity and interest in doing that thing. Then there's nothing that can stop us. So on that note, I want to thank my fellow panelists for joining me today. Next week, the lineup will probably look different again. We never know these things too far in advance. But also, thank you to everyone who joined us live. We really appreciate you and the engagement that you've put in the chat. Everyone who might be joining us a little bit later, please provide your comments. We do try to read as many of them as we possibly can and respond to some of them. And then please also remember to subscribe to the Rational Standard channel if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to make sure you get notified when we upload new content on the channel. Rational Standard is hosted primarily on Substack. So if you do have an account there, please remember to restack and also like this content and share it on other social media as well, Facebook and X. It really helps us if we can get these conversations out there, and maybe some other people might also find something insightful from them. But yeah, that is it from us for now. Please join us next week, Friday again, and we'll see what utter and unmitigated chaos would have hit South Africa and the world then. Thank you very much, everyone. Go well. Cheerio.